turned the entire courtroom against him and struck a blow so powerful it shattered his mask of neutrality. Her searing words captured millions of views, shaking America to its core. And when the dust finally settled, America had a new name for her. Not woke queen, but the true queen of justice. But what exactly did Jasmine say that left America holding its breath? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber in Washington, D.C. was a cathedral of power, wrapped in cold marble and older ambitions. High above Jasmine Crockett, the portraits of dead justices loomed, their faces carved in sepia, their gazes frozen in an era where her voice would have been a crime. The air inside felt metallic, a weight pressing against her ribs as she took her seat at the lone witness table. Across from her, the row of black-robed justices sat like an immovable mountain, with Chief Justice John Roberts at the summit, his expression a mask of detached superiority. Cameras hummed like insects in the corners. The nation was watching, but Jasmine knew few in this room were here to truly listen. The agenda on the docket was neatly typed: judicial equity and systemic racial bias. Words clean and clinical, masking the rot they pretended to examine. As Jasmine folded her hands before her, 1,000 untold verdicts, each soaked in injustice, seemed to pulse against the walls. The very architecture reeked of an old order pretending neutrality while clinging to its crown. And yet, sitting there in her black suit, her heart pounding but her spine unbending, Jasmine knew today silence would not save them. The silence in the room was a taut wire, stretched so tight that it seemed the mere weight of one word could snap it. And Chief Justice John Roberts, with the calm cruelty of a man who had snapped many before, finally spoke. "We welcome our woke queen to educate us today," he said, his tone lacquered in courtesy, yet sharpened with contempt. The words sliced through the chamber like a hidden blade, cloaked in silk but lethal in impact. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, stunned by the casual violence wrapped in protocol. Jasmine sat motionless, her spine a pillar of iron, her face unreadable, but the air around her seemed to thrum with a deeper, older fury. Across the gallery, aides and clerks shifted uncomfortably, the polished floor echoing tiny, nervous sounds. Reporters jerked their cameras into focus, the mechanical clicks suddenly deafening against the frozen quiet. Every lens swiveled, every pen poised, every eye burning toward her, waiting for a crack, a tear, a tremble. But Jasmine only blinked, slow and deliberate, absorbing the insult like a stone absorbs rain. In that charged silence, it was not Jasmine who seemed diminished. It was the room itself that shrank, exposed and meaner than before. The insult hung in the air like a slow poison, seeping into every corner of the room, daring anyone to pretend they hadn't heard. And it was Jasmine Crockett who bore the full weight of it. She sat perfectly still, her palms flat against the cool wood of the witness table, as if grounding herself against the sudden shift in the room's gravity. Around her, the oxygen seemed to thin, every breath tighter than the last. Robert's words floated above them all, an insult cloaked in civility, refusing to dissipate. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't twitch. She held herself steady, knowing that the smallest crack, a flinch, a frown, would be weaponized against her. Her silence was not submission. It was a blade, sharpened and sheathed, waiting for the moment to strike. Across the room, aides fidgeted, reporters scribbled furiously, but no one dared to speak, because everyone understood instinctively that a line had been crossed. The weight of history pressed against Jasmine's shoulders, a history that had always demanded people like her to endure mockery in silence or be condemned for anger. Seconds stretched unbearably, until time itself seemed to hold its breath, and still Jasmine sat, the embodiment of controlled defiance. Roberts leaned back slightly, mistaking the searing silence for weakness, his voice slicing again through the tension with a smooth and practiced cruelty. "Perhaps Her Majesty can explain to us," he said, an edge of mockery curling his words, "how a collection of grievances replaces the rule of law." This time, no laughter followed. Even those predisposed to agree with him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, feeling the unease settling into their bones. The cameras edged closer, desperate to catch the moment Jasmine might break. But all they found was a woman rooted so deeply in her own dignity that not even the Chief Justice of the United States could move her. The imbalance of power was naked now. A stage set against her, history weighed against her, the rules tilted from the start. And yet Jasmine's silence filled the courtroom more powerfully than any rebuttal could. She was not shrinking. She was waiting. The room expected her to explode. Maybe a raised voice, maybe a flash of anger. Something loud enough that they could dismiss her, label her unprofessional, emotional, out of control. That would have been easier for them to handle. But Jasmine Crockett didn't explode. She inhaled once, slowly, her back straightening as if pulled by some invisible thread of resolve. Then she reached forward and picked up a single sheet of paper, holding it with the same precision someone might use to lift a scalpel in an operating room. Her voice when it came was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was deliberate, calm, clear, and so sharp it made people flinch harder than any scream could. "If we're going to talk about law," she began, "then let's talk about what it looks like in practice, not in theory." She let the line breathe, her eyes sweeping across the room like a quiet storm rolling over dry land. The justices, the aides, the press, they all leaned forward, drawn in not by theatrics but by something far more dangerous. Truth spoken without apology. She glanced at the document. Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white Americans. The sentence landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet, soft in tone, devastating in impact. That's not because black people commit 5 times more crime. It's because the system has been designed, not accidentally but intentionally to police us harder, prosecute us faster, and punish us longer. The room didn't move, not even a cough. The data hung in the air like smoke that refused to rise. Jasmine didn't pause for effect. She paused because facts deserve space to echo. She continued, "For the same crimes, black defendants receive sentences that are, on average, 22% longer than white defendants. That's not anecdotal. That's Department of Justice data, publicly available, publicly ignored." She turned her gaze toward Roberts, not as a challenge, but as an anchor. Her words weren't floating. They were grounded in something he could not dismiss. She took her time, no rush. Every word carefully chosen, like chess moves designed to collapse the board, not just win the match. "And in capital punishment cases," she said, her voice low but cutting, "when the victim is white and the defendant is black, the chance of receiving the death penalty is 3 times higher." No one breathed. She didn't blink. "Let me say that again. Not 1.5 times. Not twice. 3 times higher." She leaned forward slightly, still seated, her fingers pressed gently against the table, as if to steady the entire weight of what she was about to say. "If justice is blind, then why does it see race so clearly when it decides who lives and who dies?" Someone near the back audibly shifted in their seat. The creak of leather echoed like a gunshot. But Jasmine didn't react to it. Her focus didn't waver. "These aren't just the statistics," she said, lifting the page slightly for everyone to see. "These are tombstones. These are prison doors. These are ruined families and children left behind. These numbers are names. Names that never mattered inside rooms like this until they were hashtags, until someone had to bury them." The emotion in her voice was present, not as fire, but as steel, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. This system has always demanded that people like me, people who look like me, stay calm while being broken. We are told to wait, to trust, to believe in the process while it strips us bare. And when we speak, even quietly, we are mocked, labeled, minimized. She paused again, but not because she was unsure. It was the kind of pause that let history settle into the room, the kind that forced every person present to sit with what had just been said, and to wonder if the silence that followed meant agreement or shame. "I am not here to be congratulated for being articulate. I'm not here to be exoticized as the exception to your expectation. I'm here because this system keeps pretending that data like this doesn't speak loud enough. So let me be clear. I'm not emotional. I'm not making a scene. I'm presenting evidence. Hard, peer-reviewed, government-issued evidence. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then the discomfort belongs to you, not to me. Across the room, the temperature felt like it had dropped by degrees. Not because it was cold, but because everything human, breath, eye contact, posture, had shifted. Jasmine had turned the air itself into pressure, a quiet force that pushed back against every ounce of condescension that had hung in the chamber before she spoke. The cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. No questions were asked. No interruptions came. Jasmine folded the paper and placed it gently on the table, her fingers brushing the wood with care. Numbers don't lie, she said finally, but people do. And sometimes they build systems out of those lies and call it law. And with that, she leaned back in her chair. Not triumphant, not smug, just resolute, like someone who had dropped the truth in the middle of a room and didn't need to raise her voice to let it burn. The truth had been laid bare, raw and irrefutable. And like any empire built on denial, the first instinct of the powerful was not to reckon with it, but to discredit the one brave enough to speak it. Roberts didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power came not from volume, but from the slow precision of carefully chosen words, words that could wound while masquerading as decorum. He adjusted his robe, leaned forward slightly, and delivered his strike with surgical politeness. The judiciary is not a stage for emotional storytelling, he said, his voice as smooth as polished marble, but each syllable carrying the cold efficiency of a scalpel. The courtroom didn't gasp or murmur. The attack was too refined, too practiced. But its intent was unmistakable. He wasn't refuting Jasmine's facts. He was trying to reframe them as mere sentiment, as noise unworthy of serious minds. For a heartbeat, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Jasmine to react. Would she rise to the bait? Would she flare into righteous anger? The very reaction that centuries of prejudice had been trained to expect from women who looked like her? Jasmine did none of those things. She remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table, her shoulders square, her gaze steady. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble, didn't spike. It dropped lower, quieter, heavier, more dangerous. "Is truth emotional?" she asked, each word slow and deliberate. "Only when spoken by those who suffer from it?" The room seemed to tilt with the weight of that question. It was not a rebuttal. It was a mirror held up so ruthlessly that even those seated in judgment had to see their own reflection. Jasmine didn't fill the silence that followed. She let it stretch, let it deepen, forcing everyone in that grand, cold room to sit with what had been said. Reporters scribbled frantically. Aides shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Even among the justices, a few eyes flickered away from her steady gaze. Roberts's face remained composed, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed the impact. In that moment, the battle between them sharpened into something colder and more primal. Not merely a debate about law, but an unmasking of who gets to define whose voice counts, and whose pain can be dismissed as performance. Pressure had a way of stripping even the most powerful men down to their truths. And in that tightening silence, Roberts's veneer of neutrality began to crack. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight stiffening of his posture, the faint clench of his jaw, the careful repositioning of papers that didn't need repositioning. But in a room trained to notice the invisible weight of power shifting, every micro movement screamed. He cleared his throat lightly, as if to reassert dominance through sound alone. But when he spoke, the slip was immediate, irreversible. "We must protect the traditions of the legal system," Roberts said, his voice still smooth, but now carrying a brittle undertone that hadn't been there before, "rather than yield to every trend of artificial awakening." The moment the words left his mouth, the air changed. It was a subtle but undeniable shift, like the first creak of a dam under pressure, a hairline fracture in what had once seemed impenetrable. For a split second, the courtroom was paralyzed, the words hanging between marble walls, heavy with the realization of what had just occurred. Roberts, the Chief Justice, whose entire reputation had been built on the illusion of cold, apolitical fairness, had said the quiet part out loud. Not a neutral defense of the law, not a measured critique of procedural overreach. No, a value judgment, a choice. Tradition over progress, order over awakening, the old world over the inconvenient voices of the new. And the room reacted with the merciless efficiency of seasoned predators smelling blood. Reporters who had been merely observers a moment before suddenly came alive, their pens scraping against notepads like a sudden rainstorm, heads bent urgently over laptops. Camera operators refocused their lenses with renewed fervor. Aides to senators stiffened visibly, exchanging brief, sharp glances, already imagining the headlines, already calculating the fallout. Jasmine remained motionless at the witness table, her expression unreadable. But the tremor in the air around her spoke volumes. She didn't need to say a word. The damage had been self-inflicted, clean, undeniable, devastating. Robert seemed to realize it too, a fraction too late. His lips pressed into a tight line. His hands, once casually folded on the bench, now gripped the edge of his notes as if trying to steady himself. He could have walked it back, offered a clarifying statement, softened the language, buried the bias under another layer of judicial jargon. But he didn't. Pride, habit, and the stubborn belief in his own untouchability sealed his fate. He stayed silent, sitting inside the echo of his own misstep, while the rest of the room quietly shifted away from him, morally, politically, historically. Outside the courthouse, the media engines roared to life. Headlines began to materialize before the hearing even adjourned. Chief Justice Roberts criticizes artificial awakening. During historic testimony, Roberts defends legal tradition amidst accusations of racial bias. Neutral no more. Roberts' comments ignite firestorm. Tweets exploded across the digital landscape, pundits sharpening their knives in real time. Legal scholars who had once defended Roberts' centrism now hesitated. Their emails to networks and editorial boards suddenly tinged with a cautious distance. Civil rights organizations, watching live feeds, drafted statements within minutes, calling the comment what it was, a mask slipping. Back inside the chamber, the energy was electric but taut, like a storm building pressure but refusing to break. Even those sympathetic to Roberts, even those who had privately cheered when he had used the phrase woke queen, recognized that something irrevocable had shifted. A justice was supposed to be the architecture of restraint, a body immune to personal leanings, at least publicly. By framing modern civil rights movements as artificial awakenings, Roberts had done more than insult Jasmine Crockett. He had placed himself squarely on the battlefield he was sworn to referee. No longer the impartial guardian of the Constitution, now visibly, unmistakably, a soldier in a cultural war he pretended did not exist. And Jasmine, without rising, without speaking, had made it happen. She watched him with the patient gaze of someone who understood that true power was not in shouting a man down, but in letting him condemn himself with his own words. Every second that ticked by without Roberts clarifying, every quiet scribble from a reporter, every murmured message passed between aides, it all etched another line into the crumbling portrait of his once pristine judicial image. This wasn't just a gaffe, it was a revelation. And though Roberts still sat on the high bench, still wore the robes of authority, still held the gavel, somehow in a way that everyone in the room could feel but no one dared yet to say out loud, he had shrunk. The myth of his impartiality had cracked, and no amount of procedure, precedent, or polished rhetoric would ever fully mend it. The slip had cracked the mask, but it was Jasmine, patient, unblinking, who now prepared to drive the truth through the heart of the silence he had left behind. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't need to. Power wasn't something she chased. It was something she summoned. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hands flat against the witness table and rose to her feet, her movements unhurried, yet commanding the attention of every living soul in the room. She straightened her jacket with a careful tug, her eyes sweeping across the chamber, making sure no one, not a clerk, not a senator, not even Roberts himself, could pretend to look away. The marble walls, the mahogany furniture, even the sacred emblems of justice carved into the architecture seemed to shrink against the weight of what was about to be said. "I choose to be awake," she began, her voice low, resonant, each syllable falling with the weight of a verdict, because too many before me were forced to sleep through injustice. The words didn't crash. They didn't roar. They moved like an unstoppable tide, pressing into the consciousness of everyone present, forcing them to feel what history had always urged them to forget. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't pace or gesticulate. She simply stood there, steady and unshakable, letting the truth sit in the air like a stone too heavy to lift. For generations, she continued, her voice threading through the thick silence, entire communities were lulled, bullied, and terrorized into silence, told that survival meant obedience, that dignity meant submission, that justice was a prize too dangerous to reach for. Her hands didn't move, but her words carved deep. Awake was not just a word in her mouth. It was a state of being, a rebellion, a refusal to let injustice be the natural order of things. I was not called here today to perform rage for your comfort, she said, her gaze briefly locking with Robert's, so piercing that even he, in his elevated seat, seemed suddenly smaller. I was not summoned here to apologize for discomforting myths with measurable facts, and I will not apologize for refusing to sleep through another generation of sanctioned forgetting. A few aides in the back exchanged nervous glances. One senator shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat in a sound that echoed far too loudly in the otherwise still chamber. But Jasmine's voice only deepened, not louder but heavier, as if gravity itself was on her side. The word woke has been weaponized, she said, her eyes scanning the room slowly, unflinchingly. Twisted into a caricature of extremism by those who would rather defend the comfort of ignorance than face the cost of awareness. But at its core, it means something simple, something righteous. Her hand moved slightly, not pointing, but offering, as if daring anyone in the room to meet her where she stood. It means refusing to sleep through the quiet violence that law and tradition too often conspire to hide. She paused, and not because she faltered, but because she understood the power of letting the silence expand around her words, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The reporters leaned closer over their notebooks. The cameras in the back, despite the courtroom's strict rules about movement, adjusted ever so slightly, desperate to capture every frame of this moment. I choose to be awake, she said again, the repetition not a plea but a declaration, a hammer striking iron. I choose to bear witness, to speak when silence would be easier, to remember when forgetting would be safer, to demand when compromise would be more polite. Each line built on the last, like stones laid one atop the other, constructing something undeniable, something larger than the marble monuments outside or the robes of office in front of her. And if that makes me dangerous, she said, her voice quiet but vast, then it is only because the truth has always been the greatest threat to a comfortable lie. For a moment, no one moved. No whispered consultations, no shuffling of papers. The very oxygen in the room felt charged, heavy, thick with the knowledge that something irreversible had just happened. Not because someone shouted, but because someone refused to lower their voice to make others comfortable. Robert sat utterly still, his expression unreadable. But his earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by something colder and tighter, like the foundation of certainty beneath him had shifted, and he hadn't found solid ground yet. The courtroom didn't explode into noise. It did something worse for those who had hoped to contain her. It held its breath. Jasmine stood there, alone and unbowed, her hands still resting calmly on the table in front of her, the embodiment of a truth that could no longer be laughed off, minimized, or reframed. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't seeking validation. She had claimed her space, her voice, and the meaning of the very word they had tried to weaponize against her. And she had done it so cleanly, so devastatingly, that the entire room had no choice but to listen. And in that breathless silence, the real verdict was already clear. The silence Jasmine left in her wake wasn't emptiness, it was pressure, and slowly, inevitably, it began to tilt the entire room toward her. At first, the shift was almost imperceptible, A slight leaning forward, a subtle recalibration of posture, the restless stillness of people realizing they were no longer witnesses to a performance, but to a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett had not raised her voice. She had not stormed or pleaded, and yet something in the very architecture of the chamber had begun to tilt, as if the center of gravity itself had moved to where she stood. Across the gallery, younger lawmakers, staffers in sharp suits, and senators fresh from hard-fought elections, found their carefully guarded neutrality slipping. Arms once crossed loosened, backs once stiffened by institutional loyalty softened. Some lowered their eyes not in dismissal, but in reflection, as if ashamed at how easily they had assumed who would be on the defensive today. The reporters sensed it too. Trained to chase blood, scandal, spectacle, they now found their pens chasing something rarer, truth spoken without apology. Notes that had begun as coverage of a woke clash now shifted subtly, reframing Jasmine not as a disruptor, but as a challenger to a crumbling orthodoxy. The phrases being written, phrases that would soon flood headlines and airwaves, no longer cast her as the caricature Roberts had so casually attempted to pin on her. Instead, words like poised, relentless, commanding surfaced in quiet, hurried shorthand across glowing laptop screens. Near the back of the room, clusters of legal aides huddled in hushed conversation, their whispers sharp and urgent, slicing through the chamber's heavy quiet. Did he just compromise impartiality? One whispered, leaning closer to another. Isn't that a breach of the appearance clause? Murmured a second. They weren't discussing Jasmine's daring anymore. They were questioning Roberts's judgment, a man who, until minutes ago, had been presumed untouchable. The old balance of fear, deference, and hierarchy was fracturing under the weight of his own miscalculation, and no amount of polished rhetoric could pull it back into place. Roberts, for his part, sat rigidly, the muscles along his jaw clenching and unclenching in an unconscious rhythm. His hands, the same hands that had once steered the course of Supreme Court doctrine with effortless authority, now gripped the arms of his chair with a kind of desperate stillness, as if afraid that any movement would betray just how much ground he had already lost. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer clarifications. Perhaps he understood, far too late, that anything he said now would only deepen the chasm that had opened beneath him. And Jasmine, she didn't crow, she didn't gloat. She stood in stillness, in certainty, the calm at the center of the gathering storm. She understood, in the marrow of her bones, that power gained through rage can be dismissed as a spectacle. But power claimed through poise becomes something no institution can easily erase. The shift wasn't a wave, it was a slow gathering current, pulling more and more of the room into her orbit. Veteran journalists who had covered decades of hearings, who had seen every performance and posturing under the Capitol dome, now leaned forward with expressions not of skepticism, but something closer to awe. Legal analysts in the room were already recalibrating their post-hearing commentary, sensing the tectonic implications of what they had just witnessed. Even some of the older lawmakers, weathered by cynicism and entrenched habit, sat a little straighter, no longer looking at Jasmine as a problem to be neutralized, but as a force to be reckoned with. The murmured conversations grew, but not in challenge, in concern. Terms like ethical breach, appearance of bias, and potential censure floated through the air, brittle and sharp as glass. The realization was setting in. Roberts had not merely wounded himself, he had wounded the image of the court he was sworn to protect. His lapse wasn't personal anymore, it was institutional. And that, more than any fiery speech or viral clip, was what had begun to truly destabilize the room. Outside, beyond the marble walls, the ripple effects were already spreading. Social media feeds lit up with real-time quotes from Jasmine's speech, the hashtag #DasChan surging within minutes. Political commentators, usually divided along ideological lines, paused in their pre-scripted outrage to acknowledge the sheer composure, the devastating precision of what had just unfolded. Some right-wing pundits scrambled to reframe the story, but even their usual talking points felt hollow in the wake of Roberts' blunder. Back in the hearing room, The final, unmistakable sign of the shift came not in words but in posture. A young senator, a Republican from a deep red state no less, subtly removed his reading glasses, folded his hands, and simply listened. No performative eye rolls, no theatrical sighs, just stillness, attention, respect. And in Washington, D.C., where optics are oxygen and silence speaks louder than any applause, that was a revolution all by itself. Jasmine remained motionless for a long moment, allowing the weight of her presence, the truth of it, to do its work. She hadn't seized power by shouting louder or by burning the room down. She had done something far more dangerous to the old order. She had changed the gravity of the space around her, without theatrics, without compromise, without fear. And as the eyes of the nation watched, it became clear. The center of the room no longer sat with the Chief Justice. It sat with the woman he had tried, and utterly failed, to diminish. The air in the room was no longer thick with resistance. It was charged with something rarer, heavier, the unbearable, undeniable weight of a truth too powerful to be denied. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not as a defendant, not as a petitioner, but as the living embodiment of a truth no longer willing to be marginalized. Every gaze in the room was locked on her, but she didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it grow, let it saturate the space until even the walls seemed to lean in to listen. The journalists' pens hovered midair. The aides froze in their whispered scheming, and the senators sat stiff-backed, as if bracing for something they could not stop. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, her hands still resting lightly on the wood of the witness table, as if anchoring herself to the earth itself. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried an edge sharper than any weapon words had forged that day. "If truth wears a crown," Jasmine said, each syllable measured like the tolling of a bell, "then let it be forged in fire, not forged in fear." The sentence cut through the room like a blade through silk. Elegant, irreversible. No raise in volume. No theatrical gesture. Only the sheer, unrelenting gravity of what she said and what she meant. There was a beat, a moment when time itself seemed to hesitate, as if even the laws of physics had been caught off guard. Then came the sound. The sharp, almost startled crack of palms meeting palms, a single person rising to their feet at the far side of the chamber. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the chamber, a room designed to intimidate dissent into silence, was standing, clapping, the sound rolling through the air like a wave too vast to resist. Not everyone rose immediately. Some, loyal to the old order, remained seated, their faces carved into stone, refusing to acknowledge the shifting tide. But it didn't matter. The momentum had broken past them, washing over marble and tradition alike. A new energy taking root where fear and deference once ruled. The applause wasn't wild. It wasn't the desperate roar of a rally or the messy chaos of protest. It was something quieter, heavier, more reverent. The sound of acknowledgement, recognition. The acknowledgement that something sacred had just happened, and no one, no title, no political allegiance could unsee it. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood there, allowing the moment to belong not to her ego, but to the truth she had unleashed. Her body was still, but there was an electricity humming beneath her skin. Not adrenaline, but something purer. Vindication, survival. The profound, unspeakable triumph of having spoken truth to power and watching power stagger beneath its weight. Across the dais, John Roberts sat frozen, his hands white-knuckled on the edge of his desk. His face was blank, carefully composed, but his body betrayed him. The faint slump of his shoulders, the downward tilt of his gaze. For all his years atop the judicial pyramid, for all his mastery of law and precedent, he now found himself naked before a force he had never been taught to reckon with. Moral clarity. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He bowed his head, a gesture small enough to miss, but seismic in its meaning. For a man who had once believed himself the final arbiter of what justice could and could not mean, it was not just a concession, it was a collapse. Jasmine's eyes didn't linger on him. She had not come here to humiliate a man. She had come here to expose a system, and she had done so with such precise, devastating elegance that it rendered all personal animosity irrelevant. In that moment, it didn't matter who had mocked her, who had underestimated her, who had tried to paint her advocacy as artificial awakening. The reality stood immutable before them all. Justice could no longer be hidden behind marble walls and carefully scripted decorum. It had a face now. It had a voice, and it was awake. The applause began to ripple through the gallery. First the staffers, then the aides, then even a handful of veteran lawmakers whose careers had been built on cautious neutrality. Journalists, too hardened by years of scandal to usually react to anything, found themselves clapping, their faces a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Not for a show, not for a headline, but because somewhere, in the marrow of their being, they recognized the authenticity standing before them. As the clapping crescendoed, Roberts remained seated, hands folded tightly together, his face turned slightly downward, a statue of defeat. It wasn't just the loss of an argument. It wasn't even the loss of a political moment. It was the visible, irrevocable crumbling of the myth of unassailable, neutral authority. In Washington, myths fall hard, and when they do, the earth shakes. Jasmine waited, letting the applause crest and settle into a powerful, resonant silence. Not the awkward kind that demands someone speak, but the sacred kind that demands everyone listen inwardly. She allowed herself a breath, a grounding in the gravity of what had just happened, before gathering her papers with unhurried grace. No grand gestures, no victory dance, just the quiet certainty of someone who had come to speak, had spoken, and had seen the very architecture of power shift because of it. The sergeant-at-arms, usually a silent ceremonial presence, straightened imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that history had been made here today, not by decree, but by defiance. Even the court reporter, her fingers flying over the stenograph, looked up for a heartbeat, catching a glimpse of something she knew she would tell her grandchildren about. Jasmine stepped back from the witness table, the heels of her shoes clicking once, twice against the marble floor. A sound that echoed longer than it should have, as if the building itself were reluctant to let her leave. She nodded once, not to Roberts, not to the committee, but to the idea of justice itself, and turned to walk out of the chamber. The cameras captured it all: the silence, the bowed heads, the lone figure moving steadily through a battlefield where truth, for once, had not only survived but prevailed. And outside, where the city of Washington sprawled beneath an uncertain sky, 1,000 stories began to write themselves, but none would be able to erase what had been carved, word by word, into the soul of that room. Jasmine Crockett had not just won a moment. She had shifted a narrative, and once shifted, the ground would never be the same again. The walls of the hearing room might have gone still, but beyond them, the world was already catching fire. And this time, it was a fire lit not by rage, but by something even more dangerous: hope. The clip went viral before Jasmine even reached the courthouse steps. At first, it was shared cautiously. A few aides, a few journalists, a handful of civil rights groups that recognized the seismic energy of what had happened. Then came the avalanche. Within 2 hours, Jasmine's closing declaration was trending across every major social media platform. Within 6, it had leapt beyond the political echo chambers into the living rooms of ordinary people. Mothers washing dishes, students on buses, factory workers on lunch breaks, all pausing to watch a woman, calm and unshaken, declare that truth must be forged in fire, not in fear. By the 12-hour mark, the numbers were staggering. 50 million views, 50 million sets of eyes watching the moment a courtroom built to contain dissent instead witnessed the coronation of a new kind of leadership. Clip after clip played on loop. News anchors with solemn faces breaking script to acknowledge the gravity, podcasts erupting with urgent bonus episodes, YouTubers dissecting every line like theologians parsing sacred text. And across every screen, one phrase blazed like a banner carried into battle: the true Queen of Justice. It wasn't a title Jasmine had asked for. It wasn't one she had ever sought, but it was one the world seemed determined to place on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as an affirmation. In a time starved for authentic voices, she had not demanded the crown. She had simply stood in the fire, and when the smoke cleared, no one else remained. Major networks replayed the moment Roberts bowed his head. Analysts spoke of it in stunned tones usually reserved for seismic political upheavals or the ends of wars. In 20 years covering D.C., one veteran correspondent admitted on CNN, I have never seen a power shift happen in real time like this. On Fox News, despite frantic efforts to spin the narrative, even the angriest panelists faltered when faced with the raw composure of Jasmine's closing statement. They could attack the word woke all they wanted, but they couldn't erase what the world had seen. Dignity under siege, refusing to fall. In black churches from Atlanta to Detroit, Sunday sermons echoed with her words. In college campuses from Berkeley to Howard, classrooms erupted into discussions not just about law, but about courage, about what it meant to be awake in a system built to reward sleepwalking. The phrase Jasmine had given birth to, simple, searing, irrefutable, was already moving beyond her control. Stay woke, rule justly. It was spray-painted across brick walls by dawn. It was scrawled across handmade signs held by high school students walking out of classrooms. It was pinned to jackets, stitched into hoodies, carved into the bones of a generation that had been waiting not for a hero, but for permission to believe again. Civil rights organizations, some of them weary from decades of incremental battles, suddenly found themselves breathing different air. New petitions bore Jasmine's words as their rallying cry. Protest organizers printed them across banners so large they could be seen from helicopters. Lawyers quoted them in briefs challenging outdated laws. Activists wove them into chants that thundered through city streets long after midnight. In back rooms and green rooms and editorial meetings, powerful people scrambled to adjust. Some sought to co-opt Jasmine's words, soften them, make them palatable. Others plotted how to outflank her, to drown her message under manufactured scandals. But it didn't matter. A movement once dismissed as too fractured, too idealistic, had found a rallying point too clean, too undeniable to be easily deflected. Jasmine herself watched the wildfire from a small, dimly lit apartment far from the marble corridors where the battle had begun. She didn't revel in it. She didn't fear it. She accepted it, the way a soldier accepts the weight of armor before stepping onto the field. Fame was irrelevant. Titles were irrelevant. What mattered was the shift she could feel vibrating through the country's skin, the awakening of something that had been beaten down but not extinguished. In Washington, the hearing was officially closed. The gavel had fallen. The chairs were emptied. On the surface, the machinery of governance churned on, unaffected. But those who understood the undercurrents knew better. The hearing had not ended anything. It had only begun something no one could quite predict or control. The battle for justice, real justice, awake and unrelenting, had been renewed. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in clarity, in the unwavering conviction that truth, once spoken plainly enough, could shift the weight of entire institutions. Jasmine had not burned the system down. She had shown the cracks already there and forced a nation to look at them without blinking. Outside the courthouse, crowds began to gather, not chanting slogans of rage, but singing songs of endurance, of resilience, of long-denied hope. Some carried candles. Some carried copies of the Constitution. Some carried nothing but their own battered belief that change was still possible. The air buzzed with the kind of electricity that usually precedes a storm. But this wasn't a storm of destruction. It was a storm of rebirth. And at its center stood Jasmine Crockett, not because she had sought to be anointed, but because she had dared to speak the kind of truth that no gavel, no tradition, no crown of polished lies could suppress. A chapter had ended, but a new war, one fought not with the weapons of oppression, but with the unbreakable armor of awakened conscience, had just begun. And this time, the battle lines would not be drawn by those desperate to sleep. They would be drawn by those who had chosen, finally, to stay awake. The fires Jasmine had ignited couldn't be unseen, but the old order had survived longer storms, and they knew survival didn't come from admitting defeat. It came from controlling the story. In the polished war rooms of Washington and New York, the backlash began within hours of Jasmine's speech hitting 10 million views. These were rooms few outsiders ever entered. Leather-paneled, air thick with cigar smoke, lined with portraits of men who believed history was theirs to dictate, not endure. Inside, lobbyists, consultants, senior strategists, and political operatives gathered in tense huddles, their phones lighting up with panicked texts and subject lines marked urgent. The mood was not rage, it was fear. They had underestimated her. A first and a mistake they would not allow to happen again. Jasmine hadn't just embarrassed Roberts. She hadn't just embarrassed the institutions that protected him. She had done something far worse. She had exposed the rot, surgically, publicly, and without raising her voice. That made her not just a threat to one hearing, one man, one day. She was a threat to the entire architecture of deference that kept power intact. By noon, the first emergency meeting was underway in a K Street office tower. On the walls, television streaming cable news coverage of Jasmine's speech on an endless loop. On the long glass table, dossiers, private files, opposition research folders being thumbed through by pale, sweating hands. "She's not just another flash in the pan," muttered a veteran GOP strategist, his tie loosened, his voice tense. "She's articulate, disciplined, impossible to bait. She's dangerous." "What do we have on her?" asked a media consultant, fingers drumming the table. Not enough. That was the problem. Her record was clean, her activism too solid, her courtroom wins undeniable. There were no affairs, no shady businesses, no dirty financials that could be twisted into scandal. And worse, she refused to center herself. There were no ego trips to exploit, no self-aggrandizing interviews to pick apart. They realized in real time what made Jasmine unstoppable. She wasn't playing for fame. She was playing for the future. So they changed tactics. If they couldn't destroy the messenger, they would contaminate the message. By 3 p.m., the Whisper campaign had begun. Conservative think tanks circulated memos to friendly journalists, claiming that Jasmine's speech represented an escalation of racial division. Anonymous op-eds appeared in high-profile outlets, arguing that wokeness was undermining the rule of law. Social media bots flooded Twitter and Facebook with neatly phrased talking points. Real justice is colorblind. Stay woke. More like stay divided. We need unity, not extremism. By evening, the more aggressive narratives surfaced. Jasmine was framed as dangerously radical, a divisive figure out of touch with everyday Americans, a symbol of the left's attempt to politicize the courts. Cable news segments, prepackaged and coordinated, popped up like weeds. Some experts argued Jasmine's speech was emotional, not factual. Others accused her of grandstanding for social media fame. One anchor, smirking over the Chiron, the woke takeover, Zrenia mocked her as the self-proclaimed Queen of Justice. And behind it all, the oldest playbook in American politics worked silently. Isolate, discredit, dismiss. But it wasn't just the media machine whirring into motion, it was political too. Far more dangerous. Senators met in closed-door sessions, discussing whether an ethics review of Jasmine's role in the hearing could be warranted. A few quietly floated the idea of investigating her past cases for irregularities. Fundraising emails were blasted to conservative donors, warning of an aggressive new leftist movement threatening the judiciary itself. The backlash wasn't about debating Jasmine's points. It was about smothering the space she had opened, before too many others dared to walk through it. Inside the White House, aides updated the president's briefing notes. Jasmine's name now appeared under emerging political threats. In Silicon Valley boardrooms, executives debated whether boosting her clips would politicize their platforms. Everywhere, the machine spun faster, more desperate, trying to reassert control before the story slipped too far from their grip. But it was already too late, because something had shifted that could not be unseen. In barbershops in Atlanta, in bodegas in New York, in diners in rural Alabama, ordinary Americans, people who rarely agreed on much, were replaying Jasmine's words. Not because they loved wokeness, not because they loved her politics, but because they recognized something older, deeper, more dangerous to the status quo. They recognized truth, spoken plainly, spoken without apology, and once heard it could not be unheard. Meanwhile, Jasmine watched it all unfold from a battered rental apartment near Capitol Hill, her phone vibrating nonstop with updates, warnings, threats, offers. "Be careful," her chief of staff told her quietly, standing by the window. "They're going to come after you harder than you've ever seen." Jasmine nodded once, calm. She understood the stakes. She had dared to name the system. Now the system would try to erase her. But she wasn't afraid. She hadn't stood up that day for approval. She hadn't spoken for applause. She hadn't challenged Roberts for headlines. She had spoken because the silence had become unbearable. Because too many before her had whispered when they should have roared. Because justice wasn't supposed to be polite. And if they thought fear could put her back to sleep, they had misunderstood the entire lesson. She wasn't awake because it was easy. She was awake because there was no other choice left. Across the city, another war room gathered late into the night. This one wasn't filled with lobbyists. It wasn't lined with marble and mahogany. It was a cramped basement office lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. It was filled with organizers, students, teachers, retired judges, all watching Jasmine's speech for the 10th, 20th, 50th time. They didn't see a scandal. They didn't see a queen. They saw a mirror. They saw a map. They saw a new way forward. And as the night deepened and the backlash roared louder in the halls of power, they began to build phone trees, voter registration drives, legal clinics, readying themselves for a fight that would not end in a viral moment, but in systemic change. They would stay awake. They would rule justly. And no amount of smear campaigns, no amount of manufactured outrage would put them back to sleep again. Not after Jasmine Crockett. Not after what they had seen. Not after what they had finally fully begun to believe. The backlash roared. It clawed. It spun. It lashed out with every tool sharpened by decades of unchallenged authority. But the fire Jasmine had lit didn't flicker. It spread. Not because of a viral clip. Not because of a trending hashtag. Because somewhere deep beneath the noise, ordinary people, the ones who had been told for too long to sit down, shut up, and trust broken systems, felt something shift inside them. And once awakened, they would not sleep again. In cities and towns Jasmine had never even visited, her words echoed, not on stages or podiums, but in living rooms, barbershops, church halls, school cafeterias. Stay woke, rule justly, simple, seismic. In Detroit, a teenager printed Jasmine's closing statement on the back of his graduation gown. When he crossed the stage to receive his diploma, every family in the auditorium rose and clapped. Not just for him, but for the future he carried on his shoulders. In Birmingham, a retired school teacher, who had marched for voting rights in 1965, taped a handwritten poster to her front porch. "I stayed awake then. I'm staying awake now." In Los Angeles, a group of young lawyers launched a grassroots legal defense network offering free counsel to protesters, low-income tenants, and immigrants, proudly naming their project after Jasmine's words, "Fire-forged justice." The machine had thrown everything at her, doubt, mockery, fear. And still the torch moved from hand to hand, growing brighter, stronger, impossible to extinguish. Jasmine saw the movement rising but refused to let it become about her. When news crews flooded her office with interview requests, begging for exclusives, she declined them all. When publishers dangled lucrative book deals, promising bestsellers, she pushed them away. Every time a pundit tried to brand her the face of a revolution, she corrected them with the same steady voice she had used in that courtroom. "This isn't about me, it's about us. All of us." And the refusal made her even more powerful. In a world obsessed with personalities, Jasmine gave them principle. In a culture addicted to celebrity, she gave them solidarity. She didn't offer herself as a messiah. She offered a mirror and asked the nation to see itself clearly for the first time in generations. It terrified the old guard more than any speech ever could. The attacks kept coming. Cable news commentators pivoted, painting the movement not as dangerous but as naive. "Awake but reckless," one editorial sneered. Well-intentioned but unrealistic, said another. In secret memos, think tanks plotted new strategies, co-opt the language, dilute the message, sell the dream of justice without any of the sacrifice. But the fire had already passed beyond their reach. It was carried by mothers teaching their children history not found in textbooks, by warehouse workers striking for fair pay, chanting Jasmine's words into empty streets until the walls shook, by students rewriting school board policies, quoting her speech line by line until dusty rules bent to awakened will. Stay woke. Rule justly. The system could not kill what no longer lived in one woman's voice, but in millions. At night, Jasmine sometimes sat alone in her small, windowless office, watching the movement bloom across glowing screens. Protests she hadn't called, petitions she hadn't written, victories she hadn't orchestrated, and she smiled. Not out of pride, but out of something rarer. Faith. She had planted a seed, yes, but it had grown into something wild, uncontrollable, beautiful, and it belonged to them now. In New Orleans, a city council passed a sweeping criminal justice reform package after activists flooded hearings quoting Jasmine's address to the committee. In Atlanta, a freshman state legislator stood on the House floor and recited the full text of Jasmine's closing argument, daring anyone to vote against conscience. In Portland, an elementary school teacher asked her third graders to write essays answering the question Jasmine had left hanging in the air. What does it mean to rule justly? The essays broke hearts and hardened resolve. Children wrote about fairness not as a political theory, but as a birthright. Woke didn't mean radical to them. It meant awake enough to see hurt, strong enough to heal it. Meanwhile, the old power structures faltered under their own weight. Attempts to reframe Jasmine's speech as divisive were met with rolling laughter online. Editorials wringing their hands about too much activism were buried under waves of reader backlash. Politicians who tried to dismiss the movement found themselves shouted down at town halls, not with insults, but with pointed questions they couldn't answer without betraying their own fear. And still, Jasmine refused the spotlight. When asked to lead marches, she deferred to local organizers. When asked to run for higher office, she simply said, "I don't need a bigger title. We need a bigger awakening." There were nights the loneliness pressed against her, the knowledge that every step forward would come with new enemies, new betrayals. But she bore it without bitterness, because the price was worth the prize. Not fame, not favor, but a generation that would not sleep through injustice again. And somewhere, in a suburban neighborhood, a farming town, a sprawling city skyline, someone new woke up each day and whispered her words under their breath like a prayer. Stay woke. Rule justly. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a mandate. And no matter how fierce the machine's backlash became, no matter how many storms they unleashed, they could not put the fire out, because it didn't live in headlines. It lived in hearts. It lived in action. It lived in a country that had finally opened its eyes and seen itself clearly enough to rise. The fires Jasmine had lit were no longer just battles for policy or courtroom victories. They had become something deeper, something that forced every soul watching to ask a question far more terrifying than, what comes next? The real question was, what will you choose to see, and what will you choose to become? The story of Jasmine Crockett was never just about one woman standing against a rigged machine. It was about the invisible weight so many have carried, the cold architecture of systems designed not to explode in scandal, but to suffocate slowly in silence. Jasmine didn't shatter those walls with rage or rebellion. She did it with the far more dangerous weapon of truth. Truth spoken plainly, truth endured without apology, truth that refused to blink even when the full force of tradition, power, and cynicism demanded she lower her gaze. Her greatest victory wasn't the applause or the viral headlines. It was forcing a sleeping world to see itself, not as it wished to be, but as it truly was. And in that unflinching reflection, she offered something almost forgotten in a world exhausted by betrayals. The reminder that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to mistake fear for fate. The lesson buried inside Jasmine's battle is brutally simple. Power never concedes because it sees reason. It concedes because it is made to see itself, naked and trembling, before a conscience it cannot kill. Systems built on injustice do not collapse from argument. They collapse from endurance, from truth laid down like rails until the train of history has no choice but to follow. Jasmine's refusal to be reduced, to be mocked, shamed, or softened, showed that the hardest battle is not fighting the enemy across the aisle, but surviving the exhaustion of being doubted, diminished, and dismissed for daring to dream beyond the boundaries of a broken design. Her resilience teaches that victory is not a moment captured on screens. It is the stubborn, relentless decision to remain standing even when the ground itself trembles to throw you down. The human message left in the wake of her movement burns hotter than any policy debate could capture. Awakening is not a comfort. It is a cost. To stay woke, truly consciously awake, is to choose daily the pain of seeing what others are allowed to ignore. It is choosing to love a country that has not always loved you back. Choosing to believe in justice when injustice pays better. Choosing to fight not because the odds favor you, but because silence dishonors the ones who fought before you. Jasmine's story is a map for every soul who has ever stood at the edge of despair and wondered if speaking mattered. It mattered. It matters. It will always matter. And yet the story warns, the system will not kneel easily. It will camouflage itself in new words, new faces, new promises. It will pretend to reform while sharpening its knives in the dark. The backlash will be swift, the smears inevitable, the betrayals heartbreaking. But what Jasmine revealed, what every cracked facade could not contain, is this simple, terrifying, beautiful truth. Once eyes have been opened, they do not close willingly again. Once a soul has stood in the light, even the deepest shadow cannot claim it without a fight. The message carved from her journey is not for the faint-hearted. It is not a lullaby sung over protests. It is a battle cry written in the veins of every person who refuses to unsee injustice simply because comfort demands it. It says, do not mistake politeness for peace. Do not mistake tradition for truth. Do not mistake the crown offered by the old world for the fire-forged freedom earned by those awake enough to burn the myths to the ground. Jasmine's final lesson isn't that truth wins easily, it's that truth wins slowly, painfully against the full machinery of resistance. But when it wins forever. And now the torch lies in the hands of those willing to carry it forward, battered but unbroken, scarred but unyielding. The question left in the ash of Jasmine's courtroom stand is not whether injustice still lives. It does. The real question is, who among us will choose to stay awake? Who among us will choose to rule justly, not when it is popular, not when it is easy, but when the fire demands that you forge yourself harder, louder, clearer than fear would ever allow? Because in the end, the lesson is not that Jasmine Crockett changed the system in a day. It's that she refused to let the system change her. And somewhere, across 1,000 quiet rooms, 1,000 flickering screens, 1,000 open eyes, 1,000 ready hearts, the torch she lit will burn long after the marble crumbles and the old names are forgotten. Stay woke, rule justly, endure the fire, forge the future. The choice has never been more brutal, and it has never been more clear. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. For 6 years, Bill O'Reilly paid over $45 million to keep 6 women silent. But when Jasmine Crockett stepped into that congressional hearing, she didn't just call them out. She resurrected their voices in front of the entire nation. What started as a televised debate exploded into a live, brutal unraveling of power, money, and lies. And when a secret recording played on air, he ripped off his mic and ran. This is the moment one woman shattered decades of silence and forced America to hear the truth. What exactly did Jasmine Crockett say that broke him? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The invitation arrived dressed in civility, gold-trimmed letterhead, a polite subject line. Women, power, and media ethics. But Jasmine Crockett saw through it instantly. It wasn't a dialogue. It was a setup. Bill O'Reilly didn't invite people like her unless he had a narrative to control, a trap to spring. And this time she wasn't just walking into his studio. She was walking into a battlefield masked as a talk show. He had spent decades dominating the airwaves, silencing dissent, and rewriting the truth with a camera angle and a sneer. Jasmine knew exactly who she was up against. While social media buzzed with optimism, a civil debate between two sides, Jasmine worked in silence. She reviewed old clips of O'Reilly, smirking through lawsuits, cutting off female guests mid-sentence, mocking victims on air. She pulled out files, real ones, evidence of the settlements, the sealed testimonies, the women buried under non-disclosure agreements and national apathy. This wasn't just politics. This was personal. And this time, someone was walking in with the receipts. As her car approached the studio lot, Jasmine's hands rested still on her lap, but her pulse beat like war drums. The sun was setting over New York, casting long shadows over the satellite dishes above the network building. Silent metal birds transmitting selective truths. A producer met her at the gate with a clipboard in a forced smile. "We're so honored to have you," he said. She nodded once, her voice cool and precise. "Good. Let's make history then." Inside her bag was a file. Inside that file was everything America had chosen to forget. The lights bathed the studio in a sterile, almost surgical glow, making every detail on the desk gleam like a surface under inspection. The intro music faded. The teleprompter went blank, and across from her sat Bill O'Reilly. Posture relaxed, voice dipped in civility. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, the corners of his mouth lifting with controlled warmth. "We're honored to have you. You've stirred quite the national conversation lately. Some would say you're a symbol of modern leadership." His tone was almost charming, like an old uncle at a family dinner, trying to sound proud but never quite letting go of the condescension. Jasmine returned his look evenly, without blinking, her hands calmly folded in her lap. She had heard that voice 100 times before, at hearings, at fundraisers, in elevator rides where men praised her power but watched her legs. For the first 3 minutes, the conversation unfolded like any other segment, polite nods, measured questions. Just enough tension to keep it interesting, not enough to raise alarms. But Jasmine could feel it, beneath the table, beneath the tone. He was winding something up. His eyes scanned her not for substance, but for an opening. Then, like a switch being flipped, the rhythm broke. He leaned forward, voice lower, colder, deliberate. "Let me ask you something real," he said, tapping his pen once against the desk. "What do you say to the people who think that women like you use your gender as a shield, that you've built a career not on merit, but on playing the victim?" The words dropped like a stone through glass. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in civility, rehearsed to wound while pretending to invite dialogue. The room went still. The cameraman didn't breathe. The sound tech's hand hovered midair over the fader. Jasmine didn't move, but her silence wasn't hesitation. It was strategy, a slow, piercing stillness. She knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just challenging her. He was speaking to every viewer who had ever muttered, "Not all men," to every executive who had said, "She's too emotional," to every man in power who had ever been told no and called it an attack. And yet she stayed still, because power, real power, doesn't flinch when baited. It waits. It lets silence speak first. Then it answers with fire. For a second, the world froze in the space between his insult and her breath. Then Jasmine spoke, and the temperature in the studio dropped 10 degrees. Her voice was low, controlled, but there was weight behind every syllable, like each word had been sharpened by years of swallowing rage and reshaping it into resolve. "It's not women like me who turn ourselves into victims," she said, eyes steady, voice steady. "It's the system, your system, and men like you who've decided that the only time our pain matters is when you can use it against us." She didn't blink. She didn't shift in her chair. There was no defensive posture, no attempt to soften her tone for the sake of appearing reasonable. Because this wasn't a debate, it was a reckoning. You ask that question like it's new, she continued, tone cold but clean. But it's the same question women have heard for generations. We speak up, you call us liars. We stay silent, you call us weak. We fight, you say we're angry. We cry, you say we're unstable. So no, we don't get to choose to be victims. That decision was made for us, long before this interview ever started. The set was silent, but not empty. The tension was alive, breathing, pressing against the walls. O'Reilly leaned back slightly, still trying to smirk, but it wasn't landing. His body language said control, but his eyes had already given him away. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The audience watching from home didn't see a woman unraveling. They saw a woman refusing to shrink, and that refusal was more dangerous to him than any outburst. Jasmine knew it too. That's why she stayed still. Power didn't always shout. Sometimes it just held its ground and made the other side realize it had already lost some. Jasmine looked at him like someone studying a man made of old stone, something that used to stand tall but was now crumbling at the corners. You want women like me to apologize for surviving what men like you built, she said, her tone softer now but no less deadly. But I won't apologize for standing here. I won't apologize for being louder than the silence you tried to buy. Her words didn't echo. They sank, heavy, inevitable. Not aimed to provoke, but to expose. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to be polite. She had come to show what dignity looks like when it finally stops asking for permission. She had pierced his narrative with truth, but now she was about to bury it beneath proof. Without breaking eye contact, Jasmine reached down beside her chair, her movements deliberate, slow, as if time itself was watching. The leather case at her feet gave a soft creak as she unzipped it. An ordinary sound, but in that dead silent studio, it rang louder than thunder. Every pair of eyes behind the camera locked on her hands. From the case, she pulled out a thick folder, nothing flashy, nothing labeled, just weight. A folder not filled with talking points or headlines, but with facts heavy enough to crush spin beneath them. She laid it gently on the desk, the thud of paper against polished wood, punctuating the moment like a gavel falling in court. She didn't look down at it. She didn't need to. She knew every page by heart. The lights above flickered slightly as if they, too, recognized what had just been placed under them. The folder wasn't just evidence. It was confrontation in its purest form. Inside were legal settlements, non-disclosure agreements, checks signed with the kind of silence that cost millions. Jasmine didn't lift the folder. She didn't fan its pages theatrically. She simply rested her fingers on top, steady and unmoved, like she was holding down the ghost of every woman who had been forced to disappear. Her posture didn't change. Her voice didn't rise. But the air around her shifted, charged now, tense, heavy with the gravity of what was no longer being hidden. In 2017, she said, each word cut with precision, this country discovered that you paid over $45 million to quietly settle sexual harassment claims brought against you by at least 6 different women. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The quiet confidence behind it made the facts hit harder. She wasn't theorizing. She wasn't accusing. She was confirming what the world had once whispered, now spoken aloud beneath studio lights. This isn't a smear, she continued. It's not politics. It's not some viral rumor you can deny tomorrow. Her fingers tapped the folder once. Once was enough. This is paperwork, bank transfers, confidential settlements, testimonies sworn and buried under threats of silence. Each phrase hit with the quiet violence of a courtroom verdict. She didn't blink. She didn't pause for applause or reaction. She just let it land. Behind the cameras, a sound technician adjusted his headset with shaking fingers. The room wasn't just quiet. It felt like something sacred had been unearthed. Jasmine didn't need to shout. Truth, when spoken without apology, doesn't ask for volume. It commands it. And in that moment, she wasn't just exposing Bill O'Reilly. She was resurrecting every woman his money had erased and laying their truth bare on national television. The folder had landed like a guillotine, and as the silence deepened, Jasmine didn't flinch. She tightened the blade. O'Reilly shifted in his seat. Not much, but enough. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sudden inhale through his nose, a hand that moved toward his notes and then froze midair. For the first time, the confidence that had carried him through decades of control began to falter under the weight of something he couldn't outtalk. Documentation. He opened his mouth, maybe to deny, maybe to deflect. But Jasmine was already ahead of him. She leaned forward, her voice steady, deadly, undeniable. "I'm not here as a member of Congress today," she said, the calm in her tone only sharpening the blade. "I'm not here to debate policy or parrot talking points. I'm here for them, the women who were buried under your payouts, silenced by your power, forgotten by your audience, erased by your influence. I'm here because someone had to walk into this room and speak their names without needing permission." The lights above flickered again, or maybe it just felt that way. The control room behind the glass wall went still. A producer whispered something to an assistant. No one moved to cut the feed. O'Reilly tried to regain the rhythm, cleared his throat, forced a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's keep this focus, shall we?" he muttered, flipping a card in front of him. "We're here to talk about the role of women in leadership. Let's not make this personal." But it was too late. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on his like a spotlight he couldn't escape. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence between words said more than any monologue he'd ever delivered, because she wasn't answering his questions anymore. She was answering to history. The silence had done its part. Now came the names, the ones he paid to forget, and she came to resurrect. Jasmine didn't rush. She opened the folder with the same precision someone might use to open a casket. Knowing what was inside had been buried, but not forgotten. Her fingers moved through the papers gently, like she was handling something sacred. She looked down, then back at O'Reilly, then to the camera, her voice steady but cold. "Case 1, she said. April Torres, associate producer, filed a formal complaint in 2004, accused Mr. O'Reilly of unwanted comments, late-night calls, and professional retaliation after she pushed back. Settled for $9.5 million. The number echoed in the studio like a shot. She never spoke publicly because she was paid not to." Jasmine turned the page slowly. "Case 2, Monica Reeves, segment editor, allegations of persistent verbal harassment, threats of blacklisting, settlement, $4 million, NDA enforced within 48 hours. She paused, not for effect, but to give the weight of those numbers room to sink. She went on, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, because no one else ever had. "Case 3, she continued, Rachel King, assistant producer. In 2012, she submitted voicemails, explicit, demeaning, threatening. She was told to take time off. She never came back. Settlement, $7 million. The air in the studio grew heavier with each word. Jasmine wasn't reading headlines. She was naming women who had been erased by money and fear. She was restoring them line by line. Behind the scenes, one camera operator lowered his eyes. A production assistant fidgeted with her bracelet, breathing through her nose to keep from crying. No one had expected this. Not here, not live, and certainly not from the woman who was supposed to sit still and debate. She turned another page. 6 names, 6 payouts, 6 lives interrupted, discredited, silenced. Her voice didn't rise, but her presence did. It filled the room. They weren't looking for fame. They didn't ask for attention. They asked to be left alone to do their work without being touched, watched, or cornered. And what they got was a check and a closed door. Her eyes met O'Reilly's again. You didn't just pay them to go away. You paid to rewrite the story, to keep their pain out of the record, to make sure no one ever connected the dots. She didn't blink. Well, I just connected them. On your show. On your terms. With your name on every page. And then she turned one final sheet, and the sound of the paper folding open was the only thing anyone in the studio could hear. The names were no longer buried, and the air was no longer still. And that's when he snapped, because truth, once spoken, has a way of cornering the guilty. O'Reilly's voice lashed out like a cracked whip in a room full of glass. That's the past, he shouted, louder than the moment demanded, louder than reason could justify. His voice boomed through the studio, bouncing off walls and into microphones, desperate to reclaim the authority that had just slipped from his hands. His hands slammed against the desk, not hard enough to break anything, but enough to show his unraveling. Behind the cameras, a producer instinctively leaned forward, unsure if they were about to cut to commercial. They didn't. No one did. O'Reilly leaned in, eyes wide, the color rising in his face. "You're dragging up things that have been resolved," he spat. "That chapter is closed. It's over. We've moved on. So should they." But his voice cracked on the last word, like even he didn't believe it anymore. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not even a breath. She let the silence absorb his outburst like the earth swallowing thunder. And then, with a stillness that made her presence even louder, she spoke. "The past," she said quietly, but her words cut through his noise like a scalpel. "It's the past for you because you bought the right to forget." She leaned in slightly, not to intimidate, but to anchor herself in the center of what he was trying to escape. But for them, for every woman in those pages, it's not past, it's now. It's the job they never got back. It's the voice they were told to shut down. It's the memory they still carry in the spaces they avoid, in the silence they were forced to sign. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the quiet after impact, the stillness that signals something permanent has shifted. O'Reilly blinked. He looked away for the first time. Not far, just to the side, but it was enough. Enough to show that he heard her. Enough to prove he couldn't unhear her. Jasmine kept going, her tone calm, factual, but weighted like lead. "You want to talk about closure? Closure is in silence. It's acknowledgement. It's accountability. And it doesn't happen when you pay someone to disappear. It happens when someone finally says their name out loud and refuses to let it vanish again." Her fingers tapped the folder once more, gently this time, like a heartbeat echoing through the table. "You gotta move on." They didn't. And now the world gets to see why. The more she spoke, the smaller he became. And like every man cornered by truth, he did the only thing left. He yelled. O'Reilly snapped. Not subtly, not slowly. He burst open like a dam, giving way under pressure he'd pretended wasn't there. "You're part of cancel culture," he shouted, his voice no longer composed, no longer polished, just raw, frantic, cracking at the seams. His fist hit the table, not hard enough to break it, but loud enough to try and dominate the moment. "You think this is justice?" he barked, eyes wide, red at the edges. "You don't know what it's like to be dragged through the mud. You have no idea what it's like to have your name smeared across headlines because of lies." His breath was heavy now, like the weight of truth was pressing against his lungs. "I'm the victim here. Me. I lost everything. My career, my reputation. You call that accountability? It's revenge." His voice cracked mid-word, not from sadness, but from the strain of trying to hold on to a story that no longer held up. Behind the cameras, no one spoke. Even the blinking red lights on the recording rig seemed stunned. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't raise her voice to match his. She didn't even look at him at first. She let him swing wildly into the silence, like a man punching shadows in a room full of light. And when he finally slumped back into his seat, breath short, hands shaking, she turned, not to him, but to the camera, to America, to every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet, and every man who thought yelling louder made him right. She leaned in slowly, her voice soft, but each word landing like a closing door. "Cancel culture doesn't create victims," she said. "It creates boundaries. It takes the microphone out of the hands of those who abused it and hands it to those who were never allowed to speak in the first place." She paused, not for effect, but for truth. This isn't a witch hunt. This is accountability. And what scares you isn't being silenced. It's finally being heard without the power to interrupt. Her eyes stayed on the camera. Not angry, not triumphant, just resolute. "You say you lost everything. But what did they lose, Bill? The women whose names I just read aloud? What did they lose? Their jobs, their voices, their peace?" She tilted her head slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "You got to walk away with money, a platform, and a legacy. They got trauma and a paycheck meant to erase it." She exhaled once, slow and even. You don't get to call yourself the victim just because someone finally told the truth in a room you used to control. Her words had left the room breathless, but what came next would leave it in free fall. The air inside the studio had already been stretched thin by the weight of what Jasmine said. But even that tension, thick as it was, couldn't prepare anyone for what happened next. There was no warning, no announcement, just a quiet flicker on the corner screen in the control booth and a single command through the comms. Play it. No cut. A technician on Jasmine's team, stationed behind the scenes, hidden from view, executed what they'd prepared in absolute silence. Jasmine didn't signal. She didn't move. She simply kept her gaze forward, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. Then came the voice. Low at first, muffled slightly like it was coming through a vent, then clearer. It was Bill O'Reilly's voice, but not the smooth, camera-ready tone America was used to. This voice was unguarded, raw, angry. What the hell is wrong with her? The recording blared through the studio speakers. She's lucky we even let her in the building. The entire room froze. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It was shock. This wasn't a quote from an article or a paraphrased account. This was him, on tape, in his own words, in a place he never expected anyone outside the room to hear. The timestamp in the corner read July 17th, 2015, and it was just the beginning. The audio rolled on. You think I'm going to sit through another whiny intern crying about tone? Let her cry. I built this damn place. They're here because I let them be. His voice carried with it that unmistakable sneer, arrogant, cold, the voice of a man who had never been challenged in a room that wasn't already his. The language was cruel, explicit. Each word cut deeper, not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Familiar to too many women who had sat in offices just like that one, hearing men just like him say things just like this, without a single consequence. And now that voice, once protected by walls and power and fear, was echoing live on air, in homes, on phones, in studios across the country. O'Reilly sat frozen, his spine stiffened, his eyes darted to the booth, to Jasmine, to the crew. The sweat at his temple didn't have time to dry before the second clip began. If she doesn't like the way I talk, she can leave, his recorded voice snarled. No one's forcing her to work here. You want respect? Earn it. You want silence? Then shut your damn mouth and do your job. The microphone in the room picked up a sharp inhale from someone off camera, someone on the crew, someone who hadn't known what was coming, but now couldn't unhear it. Jasmine remained still, composed, her hands folded in her lap like she were seated at a church pew, bearing witness, not to a performance, but to a confession. Then came the last recording, short, deadly. No woman's career here matters more than my name on the door. The sentence hit like a final nail in a coffin already buried too deep for flowers. And then silence. Real, suffocating silence. The kind that swallows a room whole. O'Reilly opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came. His lips moved, but his voice didn't follow. It was as if the words he needed had left him behind. For a man who built an empire with his voice, this was the most damning moment of all. Being voiceless, on his own stage. His face changed, not with rage but something worse, panic. His hand went to his lapel mic, fumbling with the clip. The wire tangled. He tore at it, pulled it out violently. The small audio pack hit the table with a soft thud, followed by the louder sound of his chair screeching backward. He stood up, chest rising and falling fast, eyes never settling in one place. This is over, he muttered. Not to Jasmine, not to the cameras, not to the audience. It sounded like he was trying to convince himself. And then he turned, not slowly, not with the pride he once carried. He walked off set, abruptly, awkwardly, like a man who just realized the room no longer belonged to him. No one followed. No one called out. He vanished past the curtain with no exit music, no cue, no saving throw. Just a man walking away from the ruins of his own legacy. The camera remained. It didn't pan. It didn't cut. It stayed fixed on the empty chair he left behind, still slightly turned, still holding the imprint of a man who had, for decades, commanded fear with a grin, in authority with a sentence. But now there was no command, no authority, only absence. And across the world, people watched it happen live. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence he left behind said everything she came to say. The chair was empty, but the world was not. And as the feed continued, what began in one studio became something the entire country could feel shaking beneath its feet. It started with a single clip, 34 seconds long, shaky phone footage taken by a studio intern who knew history when she saw it. The video didn't open with Jasmine's entrance or Bill's exit. It started with her eyes locked on the camera, posture calm, voice steady. "You can cancel a show," she said, her tone clear and unflinching, "but you can't cancel truth." And truth just walked in. That line, simple, direct, devastating, hit social media like a match to dry grass. By the time she had finished the sentence, the intern had already hit send. 10 minutes later, the clip had been shared 11,000 times. By the time O'Reilly made it out of the studio doors and into the back alley parking lot, it was already at 100,000. The internet wasn't waiting for the official upload. It had found the moment it needed. Twitter threads sprang up within the hour. Users across the country began dissecting not just the quote, but the silence that followed it. The way Jasmine didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't move. They wrote about her hands resting still in her lap like the calm center of a tornado. They wrote about how O'Reilly had looked like he aged 20 years in 2 minutes. But mostly they wrote about the truth in that one sentence. You can't cancel truth. Women from all industries, media, politics, law, hospitality, medicine, began reposting the clip with their own stories underneath. "I was told to smile more or lose my job. That was 2009. This is for her. He said I was overreacting when he brushed my thigh in the elevator. I left the company. He got promoted." One after another, thousands of voices began filling the silence Jasmine had cracked open. Instagram Reels picked it up next. Audio overlays of her quote began pairing with black and white portraits of women who had settled quietly, left jobs quietly, cried quietly. TikTok followed with stitched reactions, some tearful, some furious, all deeply personal. A former Fox News staffer, whose face was mostly hidden by a blur filter, uploaded a video that simply read, "I heard that voice too. I thought I'd never say it out loud. Jasmine, thank you." The views on Jasmine's clip passed 1 million before nightfall, then 5, then 12. By morning, mainstream media had caught up, but the public no longer needed them to narrate the story. It was already being written in real time by the people who had lived it. Hashtags flooded the platforms. #, truth just walked in. #, you can't cancel truth. #, her voice echoes. But one in particular gained traction faster than the rest. The Jasmine moment. It was more than a trend, it was a shift. Not because she had humiliated someone on camera, but because she hadn't. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't insulted, she hadn't even raised her voice. And yet she had ended something bigger than a man's career. She had ended the illusion that silence could protect anyone anymore. Television networks scrambled to catch up. MSNBC reran the segment with analysts, pausing every few minutes to explain the power dynamics at play. CNN ran a full panel. Fox News remained mostly silent, airing reruns of The Five while quietly scrubbing its homepage. But online, the conversation had already moved beyond networks. It had landed in text messages, group chats, Slack channels, classrooms. College professors opened their next lectures with Jasmine's quote on the screen. High school debate teams rewrote their tournament topics overnight. In offices across the country, women sat a little differently at their desks the next morning. Some straighter, some heavier, all watching the world recalibrate around a moment they recognized as their own. In a small newsroom in Detroit, a junior reporter who had once been told she was too emotional for hard news pitched her editor a series on NDAs and corporate culture. In a boardroom in Seattle, a CEO paused mid-sentence when his head of HR asked if their harassment policy had been updated since 2017. At a Starbucks in Atlanta, a barista hit pause on the morning playlist to play Jasmine's clip out loud for everyone on shift. "Just listen," she said. Just listen to how she doesn't flinch. In Washington, a former White House aide, who had once watched her abuser become a cabinet pick, tweeted, "It's not just a moment, it's a mirror." By midnight, the message boards filled with men asking if what they'd said in a meeting 5 years ago could be misinterpreted. Some asked with guilt, others with sarcasm, but none of them ignored it. The conversation had reached them too, not by force but by gravity. Jasmine hadn't chased them. She hadn't called them out. She had simply told the truth, and truth had done what it always does when left untouched. It expanded. It moved. It found cracks and pushed through them. It became impossible to unhear. And still Jasmine didn't post. She didn't speak again that night. No follow-up, no victory lap, no press release. Her silence was not absence, it was clarity. Letting the moment breathe. Letting others speak now that the ground had been cleared. A quiet that said, "I didn't come here to be the voice. I came here so they could use theirs." Somewhere in a city she'd never been to, a woman who had never told anyone her story sat in bed, phone in hand, playing Jasmine's line again. You can cancel a show, but you can't cancel truth. And truth just walked in. She whispered it once to herself. Then she opened her camera and hit record. The internet had carried her voice across the nation. But now Jasmine Crockett was walking into a room where silence had always reigned, and she was bringing all the names that silence had tried to bury. 1 week later, the United States Capitol was packed tighter than it had been for any ethics hearing in years. Cameras lined the walls, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, and aides rushed through narrow hallways clutching thick folders and buzzing phones. The official title of the session read, "Special Hearing on Women's Rights and Accountability in Media Institutions." But everyone knew what it really was. The reckoning Jasmine Crockett had ignited, and she was first on the witness list. The chair reserved for her sat front and center beneath a seal of the United States, surrounded by men and women who had spent decades debating bills that never once asked what silence costs. As she entered the room, dressed in a deep navy suit, her walk was steady, her shoulders squared. Not in defiance, but in purpose. She didn't pause for the cameras. She didn't wave. She took her seat like a woman arriving, not for ceremony, but for duty. When the gavel dropped, the murmur died instantly. A hush rolled through the chamber, the kind that signals everyone knows something is about to happen, and no one knows how to stop it. A congresswoman opened the session with formalities, a senator followed with platitudes, but no one was listening. Every eye in the room was waiting for the name that had shaken the foundations of a broadcast empire. When Jasmine Crockett was finally introduced, she rose without notes, without aides, and without apology. She walked to the podium slowly, scanning the faces of those seated before her, not to intimidate, but to remind them. She saw them, and she would be seen in return. But when she spoke, she didn't begin with herself. She didn't mention the confrontation, the walkout, the millions of views. Instead, she opened a thin folder, carefully, reverently. "I want to begin," she said, voice steady but thick with weight, "by naming 6 women whose stories didn't trend, whose faces didn't go viral, but whose silence paid for someone else's comfort." She paused. No drama, just breathe, just gravity. April Torres, Monica Reeves, Rachel King, Denise Holloway, Lisa Mendoza, Natalie Brooks. The names echoed in the chamber like bells tolling for memory. These women were not weak. They were not unstable. They were professionals, experts, leaders, until they weren't convenient anymore. No one moved, no one dared. Even the clicking of press cameras paused as Jasmine continued, voice tightening with every word, not from nerves but from truth pressing against the edges of years too quiet. Some of them left their careers. Some of them left the industry entirely. One of them moved across the country and changed her name. What they all shared was a story no one wanted to hear. Until now. Her hands gripped the sides of the podium, not to steady herself, but to anchor the room. "I'm not here to speak on behalf of every woman," she said. "I'm here to make sure this chamber no longer pretends it doesn't know their names." A senator from Texas shifted in his seat. A representative from Florida cleared his throat. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She let the silence stretch, an active silence, full of everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Then finally she leaned in slightly and delivered the line that would headline every article, every news alert, every classroom discussion for weeks. Silence used to be mandatory. Today it's a choice, and I choose to break it. The room inhaled as one. A tremor of awe rippled through the gallery. Some scribbled notes, others just listened, afraid even their pens might disturb what they were witnessing. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She opened the folder again. Attached to my written testimony, she continued, are excerpts from over 300 emails sent to me in the last 5 days alone. Not from activists, not from politicians, from interns, assistants, engineers, producers. Women who wrote me because they didn't know where else to send their truth. She looked up. They trusted me with their voices. Now I'm trusting you to hear them. Another pause, then, you are not obligated to believe them, but you are no longer allowed to ignore them. Her final paragraph was brief, measured, devastating. If this government can pass laws to regulate how women dress on television, then it can pass laws to protect them when they walk into a newsroom. If we can hold teachers, judges, and doctors accountable, then it's time we hold billion-dollar media machines to the same standard. Not just when a camera's rolling, but when the doors are closed, when the room is small, when the woman is alone. Jasmine closed her folder, not with a slam, but with finality. Then she stepped back, nodded once, and returned to her seat. She didn't look for approval. She didn't need applause. What she'd come to say had already been written into the room itself. And for the first time in a long time, silence didn't mean absence. It meant impact. The chamber had fallen silent, but the ripple of her words had just begun. And somewhere, one voice long buried found its way back to the surface. 3 days after the hearing, the Washington Post published an anonymous open letter on its front page. A letter that would send another shockwave through a nation already reckoning with its reflection. The headline read simply, "To the woman who spoke when I couldn't." Beneath it, the letter began not with anger or trauma, but with a quiet confession. My name doesn't matter, it opened, because for years I was told it shouldn't. I was one of the 6, the quiet ones, the settled ones, the ones they paid to forget. Her words weren't flowery, but they were razor sharp in their honesty. She described the day she signed the non-disclosure agreement, the way her hands shook as she held the pen, the way her lawyer had called it a clean exit, and how no one ever asked her what that silence cost. She continued, "For a long time I told myself it was over. I repeated the number in my head like it meant something. $4 million. $4 million to forget, to disappear, to stay out of sight. But it didn't buy silence. It bought shame, and shame doesn't leave quietly." She described how she stopped watching television entirely, how she avoided the sight of O'Reilly's face in airport lounges, how she would mute the screen if a panel discussion mentioned his name. "I thought I'd never speak again," she wrote, "until I heard Jasmine Crockett say mine out loud without even knowing me." The letter wasn't long, but every sentence felt like it had waited years to be written. Jasmine didn't just speak for me. She reminded me that the truth doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs someone brave enough to say it anyway. By the end of the day, the letter had been reprinted in over 50 outlets. It was read aloud on the Senate floor by 2 different lawmakers, one Democrat, one Republican. On social media, women began sharing their own Jasmine moments, the exact second they realized silence had never really protected them. And in coffee shops, conference rooms, subway cars, and classrooms, strangers whispered about the woman who had written that letter like she was a ghost suddenly made visible again. That same afternoon, Jasmine left the Capitol building quietly. There were no press conferences, no motorcades, just her, walking down the long marble steps of Congress as the late light stretched across the city in golden bands. Her heels tapped against the stone in a rhythm that matched the hush of the moment, measured even, calm. She didn't look for cameras. She didn't need to. They were there, of course, waiting to catch a quote, a headline, a soundbite. But Jasmine didn't give them one. She walked past them the way someone walks through smoke, knowing the fire had already been lit behind her, and nothing would ever go back to how it was before. Near the bottom of the steps, a woman waited. She was older, maybe early 60s, dressed plainly, blending into the background the way women are often taught to do. She wasn't holding a microphone or a notepad. She wasn't with the press or a staffer or a political group. She was just there. As Jasmine passed her, the woman reached out, not in protest, not to stop her, but to connect. Her fingers brushed Jasmine's arm, and Jasmine stopped. Just for a moment. The woman didn't say her name. She didn't introduce herself. She just whispered, barely audible, "No one forgets us now. Thank you for remembering." Jasmine didn't reply right away. She simply looked into the woman's eyes, eyes that carried too many stories, too many years of being erased. And then she nodded once, not with victory, not with relief, but with understanding. Then she turned, stepped onto the sidewalk, and disappeared into the crowd, the wind at her back and history unfolding behind her. She didn't need to say anything else. The world was already listening. She never saw the ripple. Not really. Jasmine left the Capitol steps without a headline or a press tour. She didn't log into social media. She didn't read the editorials or count the hashtags. She didn't need to. She'd already done what she came to do, speak truth into a room that had been built to contain it. But while she walked home under a quiet Washington sky, the waves she unleashed surged into rooms she would never set foot in. Rooms that didn't need her presence to remember her power. In a glass-paneled newsroom in Dallas, the air was unusually silent for a Thursday afternoon. Teleprompters flickered, editors typed, but all eyes kept drifting toward one corner desk, where a junior anchor named Lena Ruiz sat with her back straight, her hands folded, and her eyes locked on a single man. The news director. He stood by his door, unsure whether to invite her in or brace for what was coming. Lena didn't wait. She stood, walked the 20 feet to his office, and laid a folder on his desk. No drama, no theatrics. Just ink and courage on a page. A formal complaint, 2 witnesses, filed 6 months ago. Unanswered. "You've seen the hearing?" she asked quietly. The director gave a stiff nod, his mouth tight. Lena turned and left the room without waiting for a reply. In Chicago, inside the HR department of a media conglomerate known for its slick branding and brutal turnover, a woman named Shanice scrolled through the Washington Post open letter again and again. She wasn't one of the 6, but she knew what that kind of silence tasted like. She'd swallowed it once after a performance review that somehow included comments about her smile, her skirt, and her voice pitch. Now, on her 3rd reread, she copied one sentence from Jasmine's hearing transcript and pasted it at the top of a draft policy memo. "Silence used to be mandatory. Today it's a choice, and I choose to break it." She rewrote the harassment protocol that afternoon, and when the CEO asked who authorized the changes, she didn't flinch. "I did," she said, "and I'm not the only one who will." Meanwhile, in a high school classroom in Minneapolis, a civics teacher named Mr. Beck wheeled in the TV cart, an act usually reserved for documentaries and snow day laziness. But today, the screen lit up with C-SPAN highlights and the volume stayed up. His students had spent the semester discussing freedom of speech and theory. Now they watched it in action. Jasmine's voice filled the room, quiet but commanding, as she read the names of the women who had been paid not to exist. When she said, "I choose to break the silence," a girl in the back of the class, who hadn't spoken all semester, raised her hand for the first time. "So, can silence be taught too?" she asked. The room went still. Mr. Beck erased the board and wrote that question down in capital letters. It stayed there for the rest of the week. At a media tech company in Seattle, a quarterly executive meeting began with an unexpected agenda item: review of NDA usage and ethics in post-settlement conditions. Most of the board was confused. NDAs had never been questioned before, but the new general counsel, a woman in her early 30s with a quiet voice and a steady gaze, placed a printed quote in front of each chair. It was from the anonymous letter published days earlier. "I thought I'd never speak again until Jasmine Crockett said my name without knowing me." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The men at the table read the quote, shifted uncomfortably, and adjusted their ties. That week, they voted to revisit every non-disclosure agreement signed in the last 10 years. In a dimly lit break room at a radio station in Atlanta, a producer named Marcus sat with his phone in one hand and his coffee untouched. The clip of Jasmine had just played across his screen again, and this time, something cracked open inside him. Not anger, not guilt, but clarity. He'd always thought of himself as one of the good ones. He'd never yelled, never touched, never crossed lines. But he'd stayed quiet. When women left suddenly, he hadn't asked why. When jokes flew in writers' rooms, he hadn't pushed back. And now that silence felt loud in his ears. He pulled out a notebook, wrote down names, not of women, but of moments, times he could have spoken and didn't. Then he wrote one more line. Tomorrow I start asking questions. In homes across the country, wives showed their husbands the letter, daughters showed their mothers the hearing, sons showed their fathers the clip. It wasn't an organized campaign. It wasn't coordinated activism. It was a whisper chain fueled by recognition. One woman posted, I didn't know I needed Jasmine until she finished that sentence, and now I can't stop thinking about the silence I've mistaken for safety. Another wrote, it didn't feel like she was speaking to Congress. It felt like she was speaking to me. The views passed 20 million, then 30, but the numbers didn't matter. What mattered were the echoes. Echoes in rooms Jasmine would never enter, carried by women she would never meet, reshaping systems she had no idea were watching. Back in D.C., Jasmine sat alone in her office late one evening, staring out at the Capitol dome, now glowing gold under the weight of everything it still hadn't fixed. Her inbox was full, statements, letters, invitations, interviews, but her eyes kept drifting to a small envelope tucked into her notebook. It was the letter she had written days before, the one to the woman she didn't know. She hadn't mailed it, probably never would. It wasn't meant for delivery. It was meant to exist. Because some words aren't for the headlines, they're for the healing. And healing, Jasmine had come to learn, doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens in the quiet, in the steady, in the ripple, in the rooms she'll never walk into. It didn't start with a hashtag. There was no slick logo, no rally on the National Mall, no celebrity endorsement. What followed Jasmine Crockett's testimony wasn't a campaign. It was a current, electric, invisible, impossible to contain. It had no formal shape, but everyone who felt it knew it was real. Something was shifting, not all at once, but everywhere. In Manhattan, an assistant television producer named Erin had a dream that wouldn't let her sleep. She was in a studio again, just like the one she had walked away from 5 years ago. Only this time, she wasn't being told to smile more or lower her tone. In the dream, she was behind the camera, filming Jasmine as she stood in front of Congress, her voice calm, her spine straight, her truth undeniable. Erin woke up in the middle of the night, sweat on her neck, breath short. She reached for her phone and found the clip again. Watched it 5 times. Then, without thinking, she opened a new document titled, Things I Thought I'd Never Say. By morning, it was 26 pages long. She didn't post it. She didn't have to. Writing it was the revolution. In Salt Lake City, a university student printed Jasmine's entire testimony and taped it to the wall of the women's restroom in the student union. At first, the pages stayed untouched, just quiet white paper against white tile. Then someone circled the line. Silence used to be mandatory. The next day, another student added a sticky note beneath it. I was 19. He was tenured. You're not alone. By the end of the week, the wall was covered in ink. Dozens of notes, initials, dates, memories. Nothing dramatic, just a collective archive of pain no longer willing to be quiet. The janitorial staff didn't clean it. The administration didn't remove it. They knew better now. That wall had become sacred. No one called it Jasmine's movement. She never claimed it, never labeled it. But people began referring to it in lowercase, almost reverently, like something that had existed long before the moment it was seen. Since the movement started, before all this truth-telling began, what they were trying to describe wasn't just outrage, it was ownership. Not of a cause, but of voices that had been leased to silence for far too long. In Los Angeles, a casting agent reread an email she had ignored in 2018, a complaint from an assistant about an actor whose behavior had crossed multiple lines. The assistant was gone now, quietly let go. The actor still booked work. The agent opened her laptop, found the HR contact she'd once chosen not to call, and typed one line: "We need to talk about what happened to her." Then she hit send. She didn't do it for press. She did it because Jasmine's voice had shattered something she hadn't realized was glass. In Charleston, South Carolina, an 82-year-old retired court reporter mailed a letter to her local newspaper. Handwritten, signed. It was short, just 3 paragraphs. She wrote about the trials she'd covered in the 1970s, where women cried on the stand and the defense called them hysterical. She wrote about how she'd typed every word with hands shaking beneath the table, and how she'd gone home each time and told no one. "I never thought I'd live long enough to hear a woman say those names into the congressional record," she wrote. "Now I believe that justice isn't a thing you chase. Sometimes it finds you years later and just nods to say, 'You were right to feel it.'" The letter ran the following Sunday under the title, "When Truth Takes Its Time." It was clipped and taped on windows, on kitchen fridges, and on hospital bulletin boards across 3 counties. Not because it was viral, but because it was real. In corporate boardrooms, change came slower, slipperier, but it came. Legal teams began rewriting NDA clauses. Executives asked for audits of complaint histories. For the first time in a generation, silence wasn't just expensive, it was suspicious. Employees who once whispered in bathroom stalls now met in break rooms with open notebooks and timelines. It wasn't activism as the world knew it. It was logistical rebellion. Women asking HR for copies of their original contracts. Women rereading the fine print out loud. Women sharing therapists. Women asking each other, "How did you get through it?" And when someone answered, someone else whispered, "Can you show me?" The most powerful shifts, though, happened in the smallest places. A mother in Cleveland sat at the dinner table with her 13-year-old daughter. The TV was off. The phones were face down. On the table between them sat a printed transcript of Jasmine's speech. "Let me tell you what this means," the mother said. And the daughter, young, quiet, unsure, listened. Not because she understood all of it, but because for the first time, her mother wasn't warning her to be careful. She was showing her how to be seen. And still, Jasmine stayed quiet. She refused every interview request, declined the magazine covers, turned down the offers to write a memoir. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was resistance, against commodifying what wasn't hers alone to sell, against reducing a national moment into a headline she didn't control. Others had had their time with the microphone. Now she was making room for those who never had. In D.C., one staffer wrote in her journal, "The movement doesn't have a face. That's why it works. Because any woman can walk into it and say, 'This is mine too.'" And so it spread into hospitals, into courtrooms, into open mic nights and kitchen conversations and alumni groups and Slack threads. It spread because it didn't belong to anyone, and that made it belong to everyone. For every story shouted into a camera, 100 more were spoken across coffee tables, through tears, in text messages sent after midnight. Some of them ended in confrontation, others in closure. Most of them just began. The movement didn't need laws to start, but laws began to follow. 3 states introduced bills aimed at regulating the scope of NDAs and harassment settlements. A 4th proposed mandatory trauma-informed training for corporate HR departments. None of these bills mentioned Jasmine by name, but in each press conference, someone, usually a woman, would pause and say, "This is for everyone who was never supposed to speak," and no one needed to ask who that meant. That fall, a painting appeared on the side of a building in downtown Philadelphia. It wasn't commissioned. It wasn't signed. It simply appeared one morning, a mural of 6 faceless women, their mouths covered by tape, their hands holding pages with the word testimony written across them. Above them, in stark black lettering, "You can cancel a show. You can't cancel truth." No one tagged Jasmine in the photos. No one asked her for a comment, and that was exactly how she wanted it. It was after midnight when Jasmine finally closed her front door behind her and locked the world out. She hadn't spoken since the hearing, not to the press, not to her staff, not even to the woman on the Capitol steps whose hand had lingered on her arm like a question long unanswered. The silence that had once felt like a muzzle now felt like a blanket, heavy, quiet, necessary. She didn't turn on the lights. The apartment glowed dimly from the city outside, street lamps casting gold through half-closed blinds, soft shadows trailing across the hardwood floor. She slipped out of her blazer, draped it over the back of a chair, and walked barefoot into the living room. On her desk, next to an empty glass of water and a closed laptop, sat a single sheet of paper and a pen. She had started it days ago, before the hearing, before the media storm, before the letter in the Washington Post broke her heart and stitched it back together in the same breath. To the woman I never met, it began. She picked up the paper again, reading the lines she had written but never shared. They weren't meant for publishing, not for statements or speeches or history books. They were meant for that one woman, maybe April, maybe Monica, maybe Rachel, maybe none of them, but someone who had once signed a piece of paper that said she wasn't allowed to speak. Someone who had carried silence like it was her only form of dignity. Someone who had given up her voice so the world wouldn't turn against her for using it. Jasmine touched the ink with her fingertip, following the curve of her own handwriting. I don't know your name. Maybe I never will. But I carried your silence into that room like it was my own. Not because I had the right to, but because someone had to. Someone had to say what you weren't allowed to. She exhaled, not the kind of breath that empties, the kind that steadies. The letter wasn't polished. It didn't read like something from a politician. There were no quotes, no statistics, just the raw voice of one woman reaching across years and contracts and all the spaces where justice had never arrived on time. You didn't choose to be erased. You didn't ask to disappear. But they handed you a pen and made it feel like survival. I understand that now. I didn't before. Not really. She sat down at the desk and read the next paragraph. I didn't speak because I'm stronger than you. I spoke because I could. That's it. That's the only difference. My mic was turned on. My seat was reserved. My camera was live. Yours never was. Her hand hovered over the letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant. This act of writing something she would never send. This act of honoring someone not through amplification, but through restraint. I don't know if you heard me that day. I don't know if you saw your name buried in the words I spoke. But I hope, somewhere, even for a second, you felt the weight lift. Even just a little. The letter ended there. No closing, no signature. Because some truths didn't need names to land. They just needed someone to carry them past the line where silence used to live. She folded the paper in half, slowly, precisely. Then again, into quarters. She slid it into an envelope, left it unsealed, and tucked it between the pages of a book on her shelf. The spine read, Witness, Voices from the Edges of History. It wasn't symbolism, it was instinct. She didn't expect anyone to find it. She didn't care if anyone ever did. She just needed to know it existed, that somewhere in the world her truth had found its form. The next morning she woke to the sound of her phone buzzing, messages, headlines, calls she wouldn't return. There were more bills being proposed, a documentary already in the works, news anchors asking if she would testify again. But Jasmine didn't reach for the phone. She got up, poured coffee, stood by the window. Outside, the city was waking up to a world that had heard something it could no longer unhear. And somewhere in a drawer, in an envelope she'd never seal, sat the letter she never sent. Because she didn't have to. It had already been delivered the moment she stood up and spoke. The letter was never mailed, but its echo traveled further than paper ever could. And with it came the truth every story like Jasmine's was built to reveal. This wasn't just about one woman. It never was. The lesson buried beneath the hearings and the headlines is the quietest and the loudest truth of all. Silence is never neutral. It's a weapon when wielded by the powerful and a cage when worn by the powerless. Jasmine didn't step into that courtroom to make history. She stepped in to remind us what happens when power fears truth more than lies. She showed that injustice doesn't always come with shouting or fists. It comes with contracts, with dismissals, with a smile that says, stay quiet and stay employed. And yet when she stood, when she named names, when she didn't flinch beneath the glare of a system built to break her, she did more than speak. She dismantled the myth that silence equals safety. The world may still forget names. Institutions may still protect the wrong people. But what Jasmine proved, once and for all, is that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply walks in, calm and uninvited, and refuses to leave. The human lesson is this: truth isn't something you wait to be allowed to tell. It's something you carry, even when your hands shake, even when your mic is off. Because when you speak, not for yourself, but for those buried under silence, you don't just tell a story. You change who gets to be heard next. And sometimes that's how revolutions begin. Not with applause, but with one woman saying, I remember. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.